In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a man named George tended to his garden with meticulous care. His lawn was a lush, emerald sea that stretched out before his tiny, meticulously organized tool shed. The only sound that pierced the stillness was the rhythmic ticking of a vintage wind-up radio, broadcasting a baseball game from a bygone era. George was a creature of habit, and his routine was as predictable as the setting sun. Every morning at 6 a.m., George donned his straw hat and canvas overalls, grabbed his trusty spade, and stepped out into his little slice of heaven. He had a gentle way with his plants, speaking to them in soft, soothing tones as he coaxed them to grow. His garden was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape from the troubles of the world and find peace in the simple act of nurturing life. His neighbors often commented on his green thumb, envious of the blooming flowers and plump vegetables that seemed to thrive under his care. But there was something peculiar about George's garden, something that no one else in the neighborhood quite noticed. Amongst the roses and petunias, a single, unassuming sunflower grew, towering over the rest. Its petals were a vibrant shade of yellow, almost blinding in their intensity, and its center was a dark, velvety black that seemed to absorb all light. The sunflower was George's pride and joy, the crowning achievement of his horticultural skills. He had never seen another quite like it, and he had been a gardener for over 50 years. One morning, as George watered his beloved sunflower, he felt a strange sensation in the air. It was a subtle shift, like the moment before a storm when the earth holds its breath. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. The ticking of the radio grew louder, more insistent, and the sunflower's shadow stretched out, reaching towards him like a long, dark finger. Unsettled, George decided to take a closer look at the unusual plant, and as he did, he noticed that the black center had begun to pulse with an eerie, otherworldly light. The pulse grew stronger, and George felt a sudden compulsion to touch it. He reached out tentatively, his hand trembling with a mix of curiosity and fear. As soon as his fingertips made contact, the light grew brighter, enveloping his hand and then his entire body in a cold embrace. He tried to pull away, but an unseen force held him in place. The ground beneath him began to vibrate, and the air grew thick with the scent of ozone, as if a bolt of lightning had struck just a few feet away. His heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel his mind being pulled in 100 different directions, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling before his eyes. With a deafening crack, the sunflower's center burst open, revealing not the typical seeds one would expect but a swirling vortex of darkness. It grew larger, consuming the surrounding plants and soil. The once peaceful garden was now a battleground for the forces of nature, with branches snapping and leaves flying as the vortex grew more violent. George could feel the pull of the void growing stronger, his body being drawn towards it despite his desperate attempts to resist. In a final terrified act, he flung his spade into the heart of the darkness, hoping to disrupt whatever malevolent force was at play. The moment the metal blade sliced through the blackness, the world around him seemed to implode. The vortex screeched and shuddered before collapsing in on itself, leaving only a small, empty hole where the sunflower had once stood. The radio's ticking stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the garden. George stumbled back, his heart racing, his hands still tingling from the encounter. He looked around, expecting to see his meticulously cultivated plants in ruins, but to his astonishment, everything appeared untouched. The only evidence of the harrowing event was the tiny hole, and the unshakable feeling that his garden had become something much more than a sanctuary. It had become a gateway to a realm he never knew existed, and he had unwittingly opened a door to the unknown. For days, George avoided the spot where the sunflower had been, his fear of the abyss growing stronger with each passing hour. He tried to convince himself that it had been a figment of his imagination, a trick of the morning light playing tricks on his aging eyes. But the feeling of unease lingered, and every time he stepped outside, his gaze was drawn to the vacant space in his garden. The absence of the sunflower was a constant reminder of the horror he had barely escaped. One evening, unable to ignore his curiosity any longer, George approached the hole with a trembling hand. As he peered into the inky depths, something stirred within. A tendril of shadow emerged, questing through the soil like a snake searching for prey. It grew longer and thicker, and George watched in horror as it grew into a vine, reaching out towards him with a disturbing sense of purpose. He stumbled back, the reality of what he had unleashed finally setting in. The vine grew rapidly, wrapping around the shed and climbing the fence, its leaves unfurling in a grotesque parody of life. George's neighbors, drawn by the unusual growth, gathered at the boundary of his property, whispering among themselves. They had noticed the change in the garden, the way the plants seemed to shy away from the sunflower's former resting place, as if afraid of what lurked beneath the surface. As the vine continued its relentless expansion, George knew he had to act. He gathered his courage and a handful of salt, a gardener's ancient defense against malevolent forces, and approached the vine with a sense of grim determination. The air grew colder as he neared, and he could hear whispers in a language he had never known, a cacophony of voices that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. He began to sprinkle the salt, chanting words he had read in a dusty book from his childhood, hoping to banish whatever had claimed his garden as its own. The vine recoiled from the salt, retreating back into the ground with a hiss that sent shivers down George's spine. For a brief moment he allowed himself to believe he had won. But as the night grew darker, the whispers grew louder, and he knew that this was only the beginning. The battle for his garden had just begun, and he was unsure if he was ready to face the horrors that lay beneath the surface of his once tranquil retreat. Determined to regain control, George turned to his neighbors, who were now watching him with a mix of fear and concern. He explained the events of the past few days, hoping they would believe his seemingly mad tale. To his surprise, several of them nodded solemnly, sharing their own stories of strange occurrences in the garden that had been growing more frequent since the sunflower's disturbing demise. It seemed he was not the only one who felt the sinister shift in the air. Together they formed a makeshift team of guardians, patrolling the perimeter of the garden each night with torches and tools at the ready. The vines grew bolder, stretching further into the neighborhood, leaving a trail of withered plants and uneasy spirits in their wake. George noticed that the other plants in his garden had started to change, their colors becoming more vivid and their growth erratic. Some bore fruit that was unnaturally large and ripe, while others shrank away from the light, as if in fear of the coming darkness. The tension grew thicker than the vines themselves, and the neighbors began to argue about the best course of action. Some suggested calling in an exorcist or burning the entire garden to the ground, while others believed in the power of positive energy and communal prayers. George, lost in thought, studied the spot where the sunflower had been. He knew that the key to stopping this invasion lay in understanding what had created it. The memory of the pulsing, black center was burned into his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were just out of reach. One restless night, unable to sleep, George ventured into the garden alone. The moon cast eerie shadows across the ground, and the whispers of the vines grew more insistent. As he approached the hole, now surrounded by a thick, twisted knot of vines, he heard a faint, almost mournful melody. It was a tune he recognized from his youth, a lullaby his mother used to sing. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, yet it filled him with a sense of dread. He knew that he had to find a way to communicate with the entity that had taken root in his garden, to learn its intentions and find a way to send it back to the abyss from which it came. With trembling hands, he picked up a trowel, and with the lullaby echoing in his mind, he began to dig. The soil felt alive, writhing beneath his touch, but he pressed on. The music grew louder, the whispers becoming clearer, forming into a cacophony of voices that seemed to beckon him closer. As he dug deeper, he could see the vines retreating slightly, as if in anticipation of what he might uncover. The scent of ozone grew stronger, and the air grew colder still, until it was almost unbearable. The sound of his digging was drowned out by a sudden guttural roar that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The ground beneath him shook, and a powerful force threw him back. The vines surged forward, wrapping around him like the arms of a monstrous octopus. As they tightened, George could feel his strength draining away, his breath becoming shallow. He closed his eyes, accepting his fate, but the melody of the lullaby grew louder in his mind, filling him with a warm, protective light. With a final, desperate effort, he shouted the words to the song, his voice cutting through the din of the otherworldly whispers. The vines loosened their grip, and George took a gasping breath. He felt a strange kinship with the force that had once been his adversary, as if the music had forged an invisible bond between them. The whispers grew softer, the vines retreating back into the ground. For now, the garden was still, the battle lines drawn, but the war was far from over. He knew that he had bought himself some time, but he also knew that the real fight was yet to come. The gateway remained open, and it was only a matter of time before the creature tried to claim the garden again. George emerged from the tangled embrace of the vines, bruised and weary, but with a newfound resolve. He would not let the darkness consume the only thing that had ever truly brought him peace. He would protect his sanctuary, no matter the cost. With the lullaby still ringing in his ears, he turned to face his neighbors, their eyes wide with shock and fear. They had witnessed his struggle from afar and had gathered closer, not daring to interfere. He knew that he could not face this alone. "We must work together," he told them, his voice firm despite his trembling hands. "We must find a way to close this gate, to keep whatever is in there from coming out." The group exchanged glances. Some nodded solemnly while others looked skeptical. Yet, in the face of the unknown, they found unity in George's quiet strength. They shared their own skills and knowledge, each offering what they could to aid in this unearthly struggle. The following days were a blur of research and preparation. They combed through dusty tomes from the local library, seeking any information on how to seal a gateway to the abyss. They experimented with ancient herbs and incantations, their makeshift workshop in George's shed now filled with the scent of sage and candle wax. The vines grew slower, as if sensing their intentions and biding their time. The nightly vigils continued, each person taking a turn to watch over the garden while the others rested, ready to sound the alarm at the first sign of trouble. One evening, as George sat in his armchair nursing a steaming cup of tea, he had a revelation. The lullaby had been his mother's, a tune she had sung to him as a child. It was a tune of comfort, of protection, and of love. Perhaps, just perhaps, it could be the key to sealing the gate. He shared his idea with the group, and while some remained doubtful, they agreed to give it a chance. They had tried everything else, after all. On the night of the next new moon, they gathered in the garden, armed with salt, herbs, and a recording of George's mother's lullaby. The air was thick with anticipation as George played the melody on a small, battery-powered speaker. The vines quivered, and the whispers grew to a crescendo before abruptly falling silent. The ground beneath them rumbled, and for a moment it seemed as if the very earth was holding its breath. Then, as if in response to the soothing tune, the vines began to recede, retreating into the hole from which they had emerged. The group worked swiftly, sprinkling the herb-infused salt into the gaping maw and chanting the words they had learned. The hole grew smaller, the light from their torches flickering off the retreating vines. And as the last note of the lullaby faded away, so did the darkness. The earth closed over the hole, leaving only a patch of scorched soil behind. The whispers had ceased, and the garden was once again still. Exhausted but triumphant, George and his neighbors surveyed the damage. The plants that had been affected by the entity's presence had withered, their colors dulled to a sickly gray. But amidst the desolation, the spot where the sunflower had stood was now a patch of vibrant, healthy grass. It was as if the garden itself had fought back, reclaiming its own sanctity. Their victory, however, was not without cost. The once idyllic neighborhood had been scarred by the encounter, and whispers of the strange events had spread. Yet they remained united, vigilant against any future incursions. They had faced the horror that lurked beneath the surface, and had emerged stronger for it. And as George looked upon the garden that had once been his escape, he knew that it had become something more, a symbol of their collective strength and the bonds that had been forged in the face of the unexplained.